Now the topics we're going to be covering with Module 4 here, which is managing software testing projects. We'll talk about the testing milestones. We'll talk about the agile process. We'll then move into working with distributed teams, and then finish up our discussion with test reports. So let's go ahead and move forward. We already talked about what the module will cover: milestones, agile process, distributed teams, and test reports. Let's start with test milestones. So in this section, we'll review testing milestones, process fundamentals, and then we'll go into topics like entry criteria, exit criteria, and also sign-off. So let's start with a number of guiding questions. First question is what is the difference between exit criteria and entry criteria? We'll also then be able to try to address the question of what term refers to the collection of activities that are completed during a project. And then finally, what is it called when a person or team formally endorses the progress on a project? And no, cheerleader is not the right answer. So let's move into process guidance. So process is really the activities that are used to complete a project. Phases is a terminology that's used to describe kind of the states of the phases of the different model that's being used. So we've talked a little bit about this in regards to Agile and also for Waterfall. Agile refers to iterations as sprints, where stages and versions are really used by the Waterfall methodology. General phases include activities that include user stories and tasks that make up the phase. There's also entry criteria, exit criteria. Anything else I may be missing on this, Eric?
No, that's good. I think we'll go on to milestones, and we'll talk about that. At regular intervals, development team, they take time to assess the progress on quality, and these are milestones. These are going to occur at the end of one or more of the phases. So there's going to be internal milestones. Those are going to be the development tasks, and they're going to look at what they expect to have completed at any given time. And then the external milestones are going to be the things that they're reporting out to the business.
Now, milestones can be or may be tied to specific calendar dates rather than the progress of a project. Do you see milestones being tied to dates as primarily a waterfall approach?
Right, that's a waterfall approach.
Okay.
So the milestones and the phase gates, those are all aligned in each other, and it's the really important tenets of the waterfall methodology.
Whereas progress on projects, is that more of agile?
That's right.
Okay, great. So talk about entry criteria, because this is something you think about every day as you think about your sprints or your iterations.
Right. So entry criteria is really important to the test world. So there are criteria that you set early on, and you publish that in your test plan and what exactly your entry criteria is going to be. For example, your entry criteria to accept a build into test may include certain bugs are fixed, or certain code quality, or certain code coverage in the unit tests. It may include a successful deployment, and for example, if you attempt to deploy and your deployment fails, you failed your entry criteria, and you kick that back to the development team, and you don't enter like whatever it is that phase gate was that entry criteria was set for.
So teams that are looking at entry criteria, most of the time they look for sign-off on that criteria. As we think about the sign-off, who's usually doing that sign-off? Is that usually a dev lead or test manager? Or?
Yeah, so that's going to be determined as well, but that's going to be your test lead is going to sign off on these criteria. Now, specifically, if we're going to talk about entry criteria into a phase, like into the say you want to get into the stabilization phase, the entry criteria of the stabilization phase may be things like unit test code coverage and things like that.
Okay. Cool. Sign off. Just kind of mentioned that a little bit. Something that signifies approval or endorsement to move to either the next phase or the next sprint.
Right.
As you see here, there's different roles that have sign-off responsibilities. One's customer, may have some sign-off responsibilities. Testing manager, as you mentioned, and also maybe even project managers would have some type of sign-off as it relates to a version or sprint. Exit criteria. Everybody loves exit criteria because it kind of gives them what they need to do to get through that phase or that iteration. You want to talk a little bit about this, Eric?
Right. Exit criteria is the criteria that you've set to exit from one phase to the next. So the exit criteria for the stabilization many times will be things like no priority 1 bugs that are open. So all the priority 1 bugs have to be resolved and closed out. You may have one that says no severity 1 bugs are still open. You'll probably have one that says 100% of your priority 1 and priority 2 test cases have been executed and reported on. And it will probably say something like severity 3 test cases, 80% of those need to have been run and reported on.
Okay. So that ends this part of Module 4. Let's go through the section questions again and provide some answers here. So the first question is, what is the difference between exit criteria and entry criteria?
Right, so exit criteria is a criteria you meet to exit the phase, and entry criteria is the criteria you're requiring to enter the phase.
Then what term refers to the collection of activities that are completed during a project?
That's your process.
Okay. And then finally, what is it called when a person or a team formally endorses the process on a project?
And that's your sign-off.
Excellent. Now let's move to 4.2, where we talk about the Agile process. In this section, we'll talk about the Agile process, we'll talk about Scrum, we'll talk about Kanban, and also sprint management. So here's our guiding questions for this section. First one is, what are 2 examples of Agile derivatives or implementations? What are phases called in Agile development? And then finally, what scheduling technique minimizes bottlenecks by focusing on just-in-time implementation? So we've talked a lot about the Agile development methodology and the values and principles and practices that are associated with that. We also talked about, it's an iterative process. It has short development phases, quick, product releases, all based upon, the feedback and also the test units that have happened to really evolve the product itself. This is in contrast with the waterfall approach, which, there's one planning phase, there's one development phase, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Now, Agile is just the umbrella of the principles. You actually have the implementations, which are like extreme programming or Scrum, and I think we'll talk more about Scrum in the coming slides.
So feedback in Agile development is critical. Not having feedback is sometimes concerning for people that are using an Agile model, because the customer is viewed as a critical part of that team rather than an outside entity. Eric, you've used Agile development models as a part of your career, and as you think about working with customers, what do you see as critical in that level of communication that you have with customers?
So Agile is more communication with the customer throughout the entirety of the project. So each sprint has a customer touch, and that's, if you remember from the previous modules we've gone through, these sprints may be 2 or 3 weeks. So you're really talking to your customers every time you're about to deliver a small piece of functionality or a small set of features to them.
And the other thing we've talked about is Agile requires a lot less planning at the start of the project compared to what we see with Waterfall. Documentation is also very important as we think about any type of development methodology. Let's talk a little bit about documentation in the Agile development area. When you look at the way code has changed and how quickly that's done, and also with the feedback that happens on a regular basis. Documenting that is going to be critical to the success of your development process and also the success of your tests. These unit tests are critical to understanding how methods work, and they also need to be updated as a part of your documentation management as the project evolves. So Eric, I'm going to let you talk about Scrum, since that's kind of a key topic for you, and you live Scrum on a day-to-day basis, because Microsoft has really implemented or used this derivation of Agile. So can you talk more about this?
Right. Scrum is, like we said, a derivative of Agile. It's an implementation of the Agile methodology. So, and its basis is really that things are going to change constantly, and the user input from the customer is very important, and you want that constantly. So that's kind of what Scrum is built upon.
Now, we've talked about the different iterations, and we've also talked about the different phases relative to the Agile development model. Sprint's really the phase of development inside of Agile. You want to talk a little bit more about that, Eric?
Sure. We went through the sprints in one of the previous modules, but I'll go ahead and talk about that really quickly again. So the sprints are about, like we said, 2 or 3 weeks. That's determined up front. Each sprint includes a very specific set of features. Those are the user stories that are included. They deliver a very specific set of functionality. The development test and then the retrospective and the feedback loop from the customer all happens within that time, including the deployment to the production system. So actually, within that 2 or 3 week period, the user starts by saying what they want, and then they get something at the end. So that's the business user.
Well, now it's time for extreme programming.
Extreme programming.
There you go. This is an Agile programming or engineering methodology that's really focused on that test-driven development. And what they do is they utilize pairs of programmers. Eric, you're familiar with this. You've used this before.
Right. So one programmer will be writing code as the other developer is actually writing the test code for it and doing the code reviews. So this it's designed to go really fast. It's designed to be very similar, even used in conjunction with Scrum, and speed and accuracy kind of combined by pairing the two up.
High-level output.
Right.
So what are the best ways to manage sprints or iterations as a part of the development process?
So these are taken, they're user stories, the sprints are run through, and at the end you've got your retrospective where you really go back and look and say, what did we learn from this? And when you come into your next sprint, you can take your learnings from your previous sprint, really make really good decisions. And something that's very common to learn is, maybe we accepted 6 user stories for the last sprint. We got through 2 of them, and then 4 of them fell back onto the stack, and we didn't get to them. And after you've done that 3 or 4 times in a row, you really start to learn we're really not as fast as we think we are. So let's be more thoughtful about this next sprint, and let's lower our expectation for how much we're going to get done. And each time you learn something from that retrospective, which is a really important part of the Agile methodology.
So during the sprint, next we'll go into Kanban management. Kanban management is a scheduling model that enables just-in-time delivery of managing workflows to avoid overloading the development team. This was originally developed in Japan at Toyota, and it really minimized the bottleneck on the assembly lines. So that ends this part of the section of Module 4. Our section questions are, what are the 2 examples of Agile derivatives or implementations?
So these are Scrum and Extreme Programming.
And what are phases called in Agile development?
So these are the sprints.
Great. And what scheduling technique minimizes bottlenecks by focusing on just-in-time implementation?
This is Kanban.
Great. So let's move on to 4.3, working with distributed teams. In this section, we'll talk about communications across teams. We'll talk about risk management, schedule management, and we'll go into the delivery process. Here's some of our guiding questions. First, what is a distributed team? Why do companies use distributed teams? And then finally, what is a challenge that people see with distributed teams? Well, managing a team, being a part of a team, being a customer of a team, communications is really a central component for a successful development project. There's, whether or not you're using the Agile development model or whether or not you're using Waterfall, no matter what, communications is key and very important. As you think about the face-to-face conversations that you have with local team members, that's very, very important. Having discussions in hallways, lunchrooms, meetings, contribute significantly to your project and is key to your project success. When you're thinking about distributed teams, phone calls, web conferences, leveraging Skype, using other tools, which we'll talk about, are also very key and really help keep those distributed teams together. And then when you think about the main reason distributed teams face greater risks and lower productivity, it's because there's difficulties around this distributed communication that truly needs to happen on an ongoing basis. We see a lot of this as we think about outsourcing a lot of our testing or a lot of our development. That level of communication has to happen. If not, we won't be successful in creating our applications or testing our applications on time. So, Eric, let's talk about distributed versus co-located teams. Distributed teams, we see this in the world today because a lot of outsourcing to India, some other countries. That tends to be a challenge. Tell me a little bit about some of the challenges you've seen at Microsoft with distributed teams.
Well, it can be something as simple as having a time zone difference, and it can be something as difficult as having a cultural difference, or even poor communications, just not being able to hear each other well over a conference call. You lose a lot when you can't see expressions. There's a lot of communication there, so you really need to find ways to get around those issues, because whether you like it or not, distributed teams are here to stay. We're going to have to work with people in other countries and in other states and other cultures, and the difficulties are there, but there's also a very high value add from it.
So there's a number of risks associated with distributed teams. There was a survey that came out in 2008 that found that distributed agile teams had success rates of 23% lower of those that are co-located teams. And a different study showed that development teams that emphasize on face-to-face communications experienced increased productivity, consistency, and reduced delivery times. So even though distributed teams are kind of what the model is today, we're driving some cost efficiencies when it comes to leveraging cheaper offshore resources. But then we also have to look at what the success rate is and productivity rates are in leveraging those types of distributed teams. Next, let's talk about communication tools. There's a number of communication tools that are out there that'll help us work with distributed teams. Many of them are new for a lot of people. Some have been in existence for a long time. So, for instance, as we think about the telephone call or video conferencing, that's been there for a long time. Now we're using Skype for a lot of our team meetings, or we're using Link for our team meetings to drive some level of engagement. Other things are leveraging SharePoint and SharePoint Workspace to be able to update statuses and documentation in a central environment. Also, we're seeing Yammer. Talk a little bit about how we're using Yammer.
Yeah, we used Yammer this year in the auction project and took all of our customer feedback from Yammer, including any kind of break fix issue that we had, and it was really effective, and it was really an efficient way to use Yammer, and got everything right out there, and everybody was really excited about it.
Nice. So you're using Yammer for also user feedback?
That's
too,
right.
as part of that
Yeah.
process? Oh, nice. Okay, great. So let's talk about the advantages of distributed team. Eric, you've had some experience here.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how companies use distributed teams.
Yeah, you've got your deep pool of talent, and they don't all happen to be in the city that you're in. There's a lot of talent all around the country. There's a lot of talent around the world, and the only way you're going to tap into that is by having distributed teams. You can bring a certain amount of people in, but and you can also reduce costs. There's a lot of places to live that are cheaper than here, and there's just a real cost advantage to finding these workforces where you can save money. And you want to reach new markets. If you want to develop a product for a different market, it's really handy to have a presence in that market.
So we finished this part of the module. Now let's move to the section questions. First question is, what is a distributed team?
So this is just a team that's working in different locations.
And how do companies use distributed teams?
So we use them for a greater talent pool, reduce costs, and to reach new markets.
And what are some of the challenges you see with distributed teams?
Challenge is always going to be communication. That's the big one, but you've also got some time zone challenges, and you've got some cultural challenges as well.
Okay, great. So now we'll move on to section 4.4, which is test reports. Inside of this section, we'll talk about status and project report components. We'll go into reporting cadence to meet project milestones. And then finally, we'll talk about the appropriate recipients for various report types. Our guiding questions for this section is, what is a burn down report? How can data from previous sprints be useful for planning an upcoming sprint? And then what metric describes the degree in which source code has changed? So let's move into reports and dashboards. As you think about the members of your team and individuals, they definitely want to see exactly what the progress is being made on the project. And having Microsoft Visual Studio and Team Foundation Server involved in that level of reporting is key and very important. Tell me a little bit about the reports that you guys are using on a day-to-day basis to keep your status.
So we do use we've got a lot of reporting we do, and we'll do burn down reports. We'll do velocity, which is your work over time, bug progress reports. There's a lot of reports we do, and a lot of these reports we'll do in a dashboard through Visual Studio. Now, the distinction between a report and a dashboard is going to be a report, if you think about it as something you can print, something you're going to send out in an email. That's a report. That's going to be your weekly status report or your kind of all-up report that program management is sending.
Kind of a point-in-time type of
That's
status.
your point in time, where you've got a concept for a dashboard where at any given moment you can look at that dashboard and see what your status is at that exact moment. So that gives you two really good tools for reporting.
So there's some useful metrics. You've talked about burn down, velocity. Kind of give us some more details in regards to what a burn down report is or velocity report.
Sure. A burn down report just shows you the trend of your tasks, and that's remaining work over a specified amount of time. So how much work do you have left? How much work do you still have to do? And that's all compared to how much work you had at the beginning. And that can change over time. You may have more work 2 weeks into the project than you had the minute you stepped into the project, because scope has changed and work's increased. And these are really important things to show in your burn down report. So also you've got your velocity reports, like I mentioned. That's work over time. You've got your bug progress reports, exactly what it sounds. How are you progressing against your bugs? You've got your work assignments report. That's how many hours of work have you got assigned to each individual resource. You've got your test plan progress, which is going to be your burn down of your test task. You've got your code churn report, which is going to show how much of the code has been added, deleted, modified over time. And that's a really important report. If you've got a lot of churn, you need to do a lot of testing because it just means things are changing. And even things that you've already tested, if they've changed, you're going to need to test those areas again.
So another type of report is really sprint planning. And we talked a little bit about this as we went over the Agile process. We talked about the sprints and how sprint planning was really important and very dependent upon these types of burn down reports. Can you talk a little bit more about that for us, Eric?
Sure. So we talked a little bit before about like the retrospective during the sprint planning. So the burn down data is part of that retrospective. So you're going to take your data from your previous sprints. You're going to see how you did and what your burn down reports look. And if they look really neat and tidy and clean, it means that you're planning your sprints right. And if they look a little bit like a mess, it means that you've learned something from your retrospective, and going forward, you can take those learnings and you can make the adjustments you need to make.
So your burn down reports are kind of important to the team during the sprint. It shows the overall progress towards the milestones and helps estimate whether the team is either on or off pace to the project. Individual members can also use the My Dashboard and Team Foundation server to view what their assigned tasks are, what their assigned bugs are. I mean, it's a pretty comprehensive tool when you think about this from a tester or from a developer perspective as being that end user for that tool. Also, upcoming events, meetings, and deadlines, and also an overview of the recent progress on certain activities. Here's an example of a healthy burn down report. You want to break this down for us?
Yeah, sure. So you can see here the hours completed, the hours remaining, the ideal trend, and the actual trend. These lines look pretty good, and actually the actual is coming under the ideal. So as you can tell in this report, if this team follows this trend, they're going to finish their work ahead of schedule by, looks like, about 2 days. And things are really stable coming through here. It looks like there really wasn't any scope added because it's always at a downward trend. And the work is being completed at a fairly consistent rate. Now, when we go to this next chart, you can see, or this next report, you can see at the beginning there didn't look like there was really any work planned. And a few days in, there was a lot of work planned. There was very, very little progress made the first few days, and then some progress was being made, and it looks like a lot of hours of work was being done for a little bit of progress. And they're nowhere near their ideal trend. Their actual trend line is probably going to be, weeks out.
So you talked about the retrospective report, how important that is after each sprint. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. The team members are going to look at the progress and trends for each member, and then they're going to pair that progress and see the team's productivity. Once they repeat that, they'll look at the burn down, and they're going to establish the goals for the next sprint.
Great. So this ends this part of Module 4. Our section questions are, what is a burn down report?
So that's it shows your trend of completed versus remaining work over time.
And then how can data from previous sprints be useful for planning for upcoming sprints?
So it helps with your new set of estimations. It helps you understand how to estimate better for your next sprint.
And that retrospective report's key to that.
That's right.
Yep. And then what metrics describe the degree in which source code has been changed?
That's your code churn metric.
Code churn metric.